The morning mist clung to the thatched roofs of the village like a ghostly shroud, matching the heaviness in Maya's heart as she drew water from the ancient well. Her calloused hands gripped the fraying rope, muscles straining against the weight of the wooden bucket. At 17, her once soft hands had grown tough from endless chores, much like her spirit had hardened since her father's death 2 winters ago. "Maya. Where are you, you useless girl?" The sharp voice of her stepmother, Gertrude, cut through the dawn silence like a knife. Maya's shoulders tensed, but she kept her movement steady, careful not to spill the precious water. They couldn't afford to waste a single drop, not with their meager resources stretching thinner each day. The harsh winter had left their small village of Elmwood desperate, and their household more so than most. "Coming, stepmother," she called back, her voice carefully neutral. The wooden bucket scraped against the well's stone edge as she lifted it, her worn dress already damp from the morning dew. Their cottage stood apart from the others, its weathered walls leaning slightly to one side as if tired of standing. Through the window, Maya caught glimpses of her stepmother's agitated pacing. Something was different about today. There was an energy in the air that made her skin prickle with unease. As she approached, voices drifted through the partially open door. Maya slowed her steps, straining to hear. "Fine specimen," indeed a deep male voice said, rich and cultured, so unlike the rough voices of the village men. "Strong, healthy. She'll fetch a good price in the eastern markets." Maya's heart stopped. The bucket slipped from her nerveless fingers, water splashing across her feet. She barely noticed the cold seeping into her worn boots. "Then we have a deal," Gertrude's eager voice replied. 500 gold pieces, you said." "Indeed. A fair price for such quality. Though I must admit, I'm curious why sell your own stepdaughter." A harsh laugh. "That useless girl? She's been nothing but a burden since her father died. Eating our food, taking up space. Besides, with this money, I can finally leave this wretched village and start a new life in the city." Maya's world tilted. The cottage walls seemed to close in around her as she stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. "Sold. Like cattle, like a thing to be traded." The door creaked open fully, revealing a tall man with striking features and unusual golden brown eyes. His rich merchant's clothes marked him as an outsider, but there was something else about him, something that didn't quite fit the role of a simple trader. "Ah," he said softly, those strange eyes fixing on her with an unreadable expression. "You must be Maya." Behind him, Gertrude appeared, her thin face flushed with excitement until she saw the spilled water. "You clumsy fool. Look what you've done." But Maya barely heard her. Her eyes were locked with the trader's, and in that moment something passed between them, a flash of recognition. Impossible. She'd never seen him before. "I am Callum," he said, his voice gentler now, "and it seems we'll be traveling together." "No," the word came out as a whisper, then grew stronger. "No, I won't go. You can't sell me, I'm not property." She turned to run, but Gertrude's bony fingers dug into her arm. "You ungrateful child. After all I've done for you, this is a chance for both of us to have better lives." "Better," Maya's voice cracked. "You mean better for you? Did you ever think of me as anything but a burden? Did you ever once think of what father would say?" "Your father is dead," Gertrude spat, "and his death left us with nothing but debts and hunger. This is the only way." But tears burned Maya's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Not here, not in front of them. I hate you," she whispered, the words carrying all the pain of the past 2 years. "That's your right," Callum interjected smoothly, "but I'm afraid the deal is done. Gather your things, Maya. We leave within the hour." Maya looked around desperately, but she saw no sympathy in the faces of the villagers who had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. They quickly averted their eyes, turning away from her plea for help. In their minds, perhaps, this was a mercy, one less mouth to feed in desperate times. With leaden feet, she climbed the narrow stairs to her tiny room. Her few possessions took only moments to gather: a change of clothes, her mother's silver locket, and the small book of stories her father used to read to her. As she tucked them into a worn satchel, her fingers brushed against something else, a strange crystal her father had given her on his deathbed, its surface etched with symbols she'd never understood. "Keep it safe," he'd whispered. "When the time comes, You'll understand." She slipped the crystal into her pocket, its familiar weight somehow comforting. Outside, she could hear Callum preparing his horse and wagon. The sound of coins being counted drifted up the price of her freedom. Maya took one last look at the room that had been her sanctuary. Then, straightening her shoulders, she walked down the stairs to meet her fate, unaware that this betrayal was about to lead her into an adventure beyond her wildest dreams. The wagon creaked along the mountain path, each turn bringing them higher into the mist-shrouded peaks. Maya sat rigid on the wooden bench, as far from Callum as the small space would allow. 3 days had passed since they'd left Elmwood, and she'd spoken barely a word, her silence a shield against her new reality. But she watched, and what she saw made little sense for a simple trader. Callum's hands, though adorned with expensive rings, bore calluses unlike any merchant she'd known, more like those of a warrior or craftsman. His movements were too precise, too measured, especially when they made camp each night. He'd draw elaborate patterns in the dirt around their campsite, muttering words in a language she'd never heard before. On the 4th morning, as dawn painted the mountains in shades of rose and gold, Maya caught him studying a scroll by firelight. The parchment seemed to shimmer with its own inner glow, the strange symbols upon it oddly similar to those on her father's crystal. "You're not really a trader," are you? The words escaped before she could stop them. Callum rolled up the scroll with deliberate care before meeting her eyes. "What makes you say that?" "Traders don't read glowing scrolls," she said. "They don't draw patterns that shine in the moonlight. And they certainly don't pay 500 gold pieces for a village girl." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Observant. Your father mentioned that about you." Maya's heart stopped. You knew my father." "Perhaps it's time we had a proper conversation." Callum reached into his cloak and withdrew an object wrapped in silk. As he unfolded the fabric, Maya gasped. There, etched in metal and crystal, was a map unlike any she'd ever seen. It seemed to shift and change as she watched, mountains rising and falling like waves on a sea of parchment. "This is no ordinary map," he said, tracing one of the shifting paths with a finger. "Just as I am no ordinary trader, and you, Maya, are no ordinary girl." A memory stirred her father, in his final days, speaking of a legacy she was too young to understand. "What do you mean?" But Callum's attention had shifted to the path ahead. The mist had grown thicker, taking on an unnatural purple hue. "We're being followed," he said quietly, his hand moving to a strange device at his belt that looked like a compass but pointed straight up into the sky. Maya turned, seeing nothing but swirling fog. Yet there was something, a whisper in the air, a shadow deeper than the others. Fear crept up her spine. "Take this." Callum pressed a small amulet into her hand. It was warm to the touch, humming with energy she didn't understand. "Whatever happens, don't let go of it." The wagon lurched forward with new urgency. Maya clutched the amulet as they rounded a sharp bend, the horse's hooves striking sparks against the stone. A howl echoed through the mountains. No wolf she'd ever heard made a sound like that. "What's happening?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "The Shadowmenders," Callum said grimly. "They've been hunting me, hunting you since your father died. They seek what we protect." "We? I don't protect anything. The crystal your father gave you says otherwise." Maya's hand flew to her pocket where the crystal lay hidden. "How did you?" "There's no time," Callum interrupted. From beneath the wagon's seat, he pulled out a wooden box carved with the same symbols as her crystal. Inside lay an assortment of objects that defied explanation: stones that floated in mid-air, vials of liquid that moved against gravity, and what appeared to be a sword hilt without a blade. The howl came again, closer now. The mist parted briefly, revealing a glimpse of their pursuers, dark shapes that seemed to flow rather than run, their forms constantly shifting. Callum pressed the bladeless sword hilt into her free hand. "If they get too close, point it and think of light." "But there's no blade." "Trust that there is." The wagon crested a rise, and Maya's protest died in her throat. Before them stood a sheer cliff face, easily hundreds of feet high. Symbols like those on her crystal covered its surface, glowing faintly in the mist. "Hold tight," Callum commanded, pulling a pendant from around his neck. As he held it up, the symbols on the cliff blazed to life, forming patterns that hurt Maya's eyes to look at. The shadowy pursuers were visible now, closing in from behind. Maya raised the sword hilt, her hand trembling. "Think of light," she told herself. The hilt grew warm, and suddenly a blade of pure golden energy burst forth with a sound like singing crystal. "The entrance will only open for a moment," Callum shouted over the growing wind. "When I say now, jump." The cliff face began to ripple like water. The shadows were almost upon them, their forms resolving into creatures out of nightmare. Maya's heart pounded against her ribs as Callum stood, one hand holding the pendant, the other gripping her arm. Now. They leaped from the wagon as the cliff face dissolved into a doorway of light. Maya caught one last glimpse of the shadow creatures recoiling from her glowing blade before the light engulfed them. There was a sensation of falling, spinning, the world turning inside out. Then darkness. When Maya opened her eyes, they were somewhere else entirely. The wagon, the mountain path, and their pursuers were gone. Instead, they stood in a vast chamber carved from living crystal, its walls covered in the same mysterious symbols that seemed to follow her everywhere now. "Welcome," Callum said softly, "to the first archive." Maya stared at the endless rows of crystalline shelves stretching into the distance, each holding objects that pulsed with their own inner light. This was no trader's warehouse. This was something else entirely, something ancient and powerful. "What is this place?" she whispered. "Who are you really? And what does any of this have to do with me?" Callum's expression grew serious. "This, Maya, is your inheritance. And it's time you learned the truth about who you really are." In her pocket, her father's crystal began to glow. The first archive's crystalline chamber opened into a series of winding corridors, each one seemingly alive with flowing light beneath translucent walls. Maya followed Callum, her mind still reeling from their escape. The hilt of the light sword hung silent at her belt now, but she could still feel its warmth against her hip. "The archive is just the outer chamber," Callum explained as they walked. "The temple itself lies deeper within the mountain." Temple, Maya's voice echoed off the crystal walls. "I thought this was some kind of magical library." Callum smiled. "It's both, and neither. The ancient ones who built this place didn't distinguish between knowledge and power, wisdom and magic. To them, it was all one and the same." They reached a vast circular door, its surface etched with concentric rings of symbols. Callum placed his hand at its center, and the rings began to rotate, each one moving independently until they aligned with a sound like distant bells. "This is where it begins," he said, turning to face her. "The true test of whether I was right about you." The door swung open silently, revealing a sight that took Maya's breath away. They stood at the edge of an enormous cavern, but unlike any natural formation she'd ever seen. Crystal spires rose from floor to ceiling like the pipes of some massive organ, each one thrumming with different colored light. Bridges of what appeared to be solid moonlight spanned the gaps between floating platforms, and at the center of it all stood a pyramid of pure light, its apex disappearing into the darkness above. "By all the stars," Maya whispered, her voice small in the vastness. "This is the Heart Temple," Callum said. "For 10,000 years it has stood as the repository of humanity's greatest mysteries and most dangerous knowledge. And for all that time, there have been guardians to protect it. Like you." Yes, he touched the pendant at his neck. "I am the current keeper of mysteries, charged with protecting not just the artifacts and knowledge stored here, but the very fabric of reality they represent." Maya's mind raced to catch up with everything she was seeing, everything she was learning. "And my father, was he?" "Your father was my predecessor," Callum said gently. "He was training me to take his place when he discovered something that changed everything. He knew then that he wouldn't live to complete my training, or to begin yours." Maya's hand went to the crystal in her pocket. It was pulsing now, in time with the lights of the temple. "The role of keeper cannot be passed to just anyone. It requires a specific bloodline, one that can channel the temple's energy without being consumed by it. Your father was the last of his line, or so we thought, until he revealed your existence." They began walking across one of the moonlight bridges. Maya tried not to look down at the endless drop below, focusing instead on Callum's words. "But why didn't he tell me? Why leave me with her? To protect you." The Shadowmenders had already caught his scent. He knew they would come for him eventually. "Hiding you in plain sight," in a small village with no trace of magic, was the only way to keep you safe until you were ready. They reached a platform that held what appeared to be a simple pedestal. On it sat a crystal identical to the one Maya carried. "Take out your crystal," Callum instructed. Maya did so, noticing for the first time how the symbols on its surface had begun to glow brighter. "This is your first test," Callum said. "Place your crystal on the pedestal. If you are truly of the bloodline, if you are meant to be a keeper, it will respond." Maya stepped forward, her heart pounding. As she reached for the pedestal, something made her hesitate. What happens if I'm not? If it doesn't respond? "Then we find another way," Callum said simply. "But I don't believe that will be necessary." Taking a deep breath, Maya placed her crystal next to its twin. For a moment, nothing happened. Then both crystals began to shine, their light growing brighter and brighter until she had to shield her eyes. She felt something then, a connection, a resonance that seemed to flow through her very being. The light subsided, revealing that the two crystals had merged into one, larger crystal that now floated an inch above the pedestal's surface. "Well done," Callum said softly. "You've passed the first test." "I don't understand," Maya said, staring at the floating crystal. "What did I do?" "You proved your bloodline. But more importantly, you showed wisdom in questioning the consequences before acting. A true keeper must always consider the impact of their actions." The crystal floated toward Maya, and instinctively she cupped her hands beneath it. As it settled into her palms, she felt a surge of energy flow through her, and suddenly the symbols covering the temple walls weren't just decorative patterns, they were words, equations, stories written in a language she somehow now understood. "How is this possible?" she gasped. "The crystal has awakened your inherited abilities. You can now read the ancient language of the keepers, and that's just the beginning." Callum's expression grew serious. "But with this gift comes great responsibility. The Shadowmenders will sense your awakening. They will come in force now, seeking to destroy what we protect." Maya looked around the vast temple, at the countless mysteries it contained, then down at the crystal in her hands. She thought of her father, choosing to hide her away to keep her safe, preparing her for this moment without her knowing. "Then we better start my training," she said firmly, "because I won't let them destroy my father's legacy." Callum smiled. "Your legacy now, Maya. Your legacy now." In the days following Maya's awakening, the Heart Temple became both sanctuary and enigma. She spent hours in the archive, learning to decipher the ancient texts that now called to her. But questions burned in her mind, growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, as she practiced controlling the light sword under Callum's guidance, she finally voiced them. "Why me?" she asked, lowering the glowing blade. "I know I'm of the bloodline, but there must be more to it than that. You didn't just happen to find me." Callum was quiet for a long moment, his golden brown eyes reflecting the sword's light. "No," he said finally, "I didn't." He led her to a small chamber she hadn't seen before, its walls covered in a single continuous mural. The images seemed to move slightly when she looked at them directly, telling a story she couldn't quite grasp. 3 months before your father died. Callum began, he showed me this chamber. The prophecy written here speaks of a time when darkness would rise again, seeking to unmake the very foundations of reality. It speaks of a guardian who would emerge from shadow and loss, bearing both the blood of the ancients and a pure heart forged in adversity. Maya studied the mural more closely. One figure stood out, a young woman holding a sword of light, facing a tide of darkness. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized her own features in the painted figure. "Your father knew," Callum continued softly. "He knew you were the one spoken of here. That's why he gave you the crystal, why he placed you where I would eventually find you. Even your stepmother's cruelty served a purpose. It helped shape you without breaking you." He knew. Maya's voice cracked. "He knew, and he still left me there." It was the hardest decision he ever made. Callum's voice held a deep sadness. "I was there in his final hours. His last words were about you, not just as his daughter, but as the future of everything we protect here." Maya turned away from the mural, emotions warring inside her. "How can I be this prophesied guardian? I'm just me, a village girl who couldn't even prevent herself from being sold. Yet here you stand, already mastering abilities that took others years to grasp. Your father saw in you what I now see, not just power, but wisdom, compassion, the ability to face darkness without becoming it. He reached into his robes and withdrew a small journal bound in worn leather. Your father left this for you. I was to give it to you only when you were ready to understand. Maya took the journal with trembling hands. Inside, she found pages filled with her father's familiar handwriting, but in the ancient language she could now read. Tears blurred her vision as she read his words. My dearest Maya, if you're reading this, then the time has come. The burden I place on your shoulders is heavy. But I have watched you grow with such pride. Your heart remains pure despite life's cruelties, your spirit strong despite its wounds. You are more than my daughter, you are the light that will stand against the coming darkness. She closed the journal, unable to read more through her tears. Callum placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. I know it's overwhelming, he said, but you're not alone in this. Your father trained me to guide you, to help you fulfill your destiny. Maya wiped her eyes, looking back at the mural. The shadow menders, they're this darkness the prophecy speaks of. They're its harbingers. They seek to corrupt the knowledge we protect, to twist it into something that would unravel the very fabric of reality. Only a guardian of pure heart can stop them. Maya touched her father's journal, feeling the love and sacrifice contained within its pages. Slowly, the confusion and anger began to transform into something else, purpose. Then teach me, she said, meeting Callum's eyes with new determination. Teach me everything I need to know to protect what my father died defending. Callum smiled, and for the first time Maya saw him not as her captor or even her mentor, but as someone who had loved and respected her father as much as she had, someone she could trust. We begin at dawn, he said simply. Weeks blurred into months as Maya immersed herself in the ancient arts of the keepers. Each dawn brought new challenges, each dusk new revelations. Under Callum's guidance, she discovered abilities she never dreamed possible. The treasure we protect isn't gold or jewels, Callum explained one morning as they stood before the pyramid of light at the temple's heart. It's knowledge, pure, unfiltered truth about the nature of reality itself. In the wrong hands, it could unmake the world. Maya raised her hands, concentrating on the energy flowing through her. A sphere of pure light formed between her palms, spinning gently. Like this? This power. That's just the surface, Callum said, watching her with approval. The real treasure is understanding how to use it wisely. Day by day, Maya's confidence grew. She learned to read the complex equations written in light upon the temple walls, to channel energy through the crystals she now wore as a pendant, to move between spaces in the blink of an eye. The light sword became an extension of her will, its blade changing color with her emotions. But it wasn't all combat and magic. Hours were spent in quiet meditation, learning to sense the delicate threads that bound reality together. She studied ancient histories, philosophical texts, and the complex moral codes that had guided keepers for millennia. Power without wisdom is worse than no power at all, Callum would remind her. We protect the knowledge not by hoarding it, but by understanding when and how it should be used. One evening, as they shared a meal in the archive, Maya noticed Callum watching her with an odd expression. What is it? She asked. I was just thinking about how far you've come, he said. When I first found you in that village, you were broken, angry, afraid. Now look at you, you've grown into exactly who your father knew you could be. Maya smiled, touching the crystal at her neck. I understand now why he did what he did. All of it, even leaving me with Gertrude, helped prepare me for this. She stood and walked to one of the crystal walls, watching the light patterns dance within. The real treasure isn't just the knowledge we protect, is it? It's the understanding that everything, even pain, even loss, serves a purpose in the greater pattern. Callum nodded approvingly. You're beginning to think like a true keeper. I still have so much to learn, Maya said, creating a complex pattern of light with a casual wave of her hand. But for the first time in my life, I feel complete, like I've found where I belong. The shadow menders will come again, Callum warned. They grow stronger with each passing day. Maya's expression hardened with determination. Let them come. I'm not that helpless village girl anymore, she turned to her mentor, eyes shining with purpose. I am my father's daughter, and I am a keeper of the ancient treasure. The crystal around her neck pulsed with light, responding to her conviction. Callum smiled, seeing in her the fulfillment of both prophecy and promise. "Yes," he said softly, "you are." The light patterns on the walls seemed to brighten, as if the temple itself was acknowledging her transformation. Maya stood tall, no longer bowed by the weight of her destiny but embracing it. She was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. She was ready to become the guardian she was born to be. Maya stood at the entrance of the ancient temple, her heart pounding against her ribs. The weathered stone steps seemed to stretch endlessly upward, disappearing into the mist. This was the final test that would determine not just her future, but the fate of both worlds she now called home. A familiar voice cut through the fog. "I always knew you'd make it this far." Maya whirled around to find herself face to face with her stepmother, Catherine. The woman who had once filled her childhood with doubt now looked smaller somehow, more human. "What are you doing here?" Maya's fingers instinctively tightened around her staff, its crystal core pulsing with energy. Catherine took a hesitant step forward. "I came to make things right. I was wrong, Maya. My fear of your power, of what you could become, it blinded me to who you really are." Maya's mind flashed back to all the times she'd hidden her abilities, the countless nights spent practicing in secret. The memory of her father's disappointed face when she'd finally revealed her true nature still stung. But now, standing here, she realized those challenges had shaped her into who she was meant to be. The temple's ancient magic surged around them, responding to Maya's emotional turbulence. Ghostly figures emerged from the mist shadows of her past failures, her deepest fears given form. She saw herself as a child, afraid and alone. She saw the faces of those she'd failed to protect. The final challenge isn't about power, Maya realized aloud, her voice steady despite her racing thoughts. It's about acceptance. With trembling hands, she lowered her staff. The shadows pressed closer, but Maya stood her ground. She faced each spectre of her past, acknowledging the pain, the fear, the anger, and then letting it go. One by one, the apparitions faded. Catherine watched in awe as Maya's natural magic filled the temple courtyard with soft, golden light. "You've grown so much," she whispered. "We both have," Maya replied, extending her hand to her stepmother. As their fingers touched, the last of the mist dissipated, revealing the temple's true form, a bridge between worlds, just like Maya herself. The choice before her was clear now. She didn't have to pick between her mundane life and her magical destiny. The real power lay in embracing both, in being the bridge that could unite two worlds. Maya took her first step forward, ready to accept her role as guardian, protector, and peacemaker. Behind her, the sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows that seemed to bow in recognition of their new guardian. Maya smiled, feeling truly whole for the first time in her life. Her journey hadn't ended, it was just beginning. Maya stood atop the temple steps, watching the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant hues of gold and pink. The ancient treasure, no longer hidden away in darkness, floated before her, its light pulsing in harmony with her own magic. But now she understood the real treasure had never been the artifact itself, but the journey that led her to this moment. Elder Chen approached, his wise eyes twinkling with pride. "The temple has chosen well," he said, placing a weathered hand on her shoulder. "You have proven that true worth lies not in power alone, but in the wisdom to use it wisely." Maya turned to find Catherine watching from a few steps below, tears streaming down her face. Years of misunderstanding melted away as Maya descended to embrace her stepmother. "I spent so long trying to protect you by keeping you from your destiny," Catherine whispered. "I never realized that embracing it would make you stronger." Together, they walked back to the temple's heart, where Maya would begin her new role as co-guardian. The position had always been meant for two, one foot in the magical world, one in the mundane. Just like her. The realization made her smile. As Elder Chen began the ancient ritual to officially install her as guardian, Maya caught glimpses of her future in the treasure's shifting light, teaching young magic users to embrace their gifts, building bridges between the two worlds she called home, and finally being true to herself without fear or shame. The temple hummed with ancient power as the ceremony concluded, but Maya felt only peace. Her transformation wasn't just about becoming a guardian, it was about becoming herself. As she looked out over the misty valley below, she knew that somewhere out there, other lost souls were searching for their path. Perhaps now she could help them find their way, just as she had found hers. Ready, Elder Chen asked, gesturing toward their first task together. Maya nodded, feeling the warmth of both worlds flowing through her veins. Ready,